Thank you, Madam Chairman and friends. I'm very honoured to have the chance of talking here today at this significant meeting. I think Irexit Freedom to Prosper is a very important new initiative. It's early days, but it's certainly meeting a lack, and I think it will go far over the periods ahead and the years to come. I've been at this EU critical business for many a long year. I've always been opposed to the development of a supranational thing in Europe on democratic and internationalist grounds. Democracy, in my opinion, can only exist at the level of the national community, where there's a demos, a people who are willing to accept majority rule because it's their community, their people. The Irish people want to be ruled by an Irish government that they elect. But at the EU level, of course, that is not the case. You have a supranational rule, and nowadays, in fact, the vast majority of our economic laws and many of our social laws come from Brussels. There's something like 100,000 legal acts that are binding on Ireland. Many of these are standards of one kind or another that we have to obey as European standards, and if the Irish state doesn't obey them, it's subject in principle to fines, and often heavy fines. This is far from the unfettered control of Irish destinies, which the people who signed the 1916 proclamation way back 100 years or more ago did in order to establish an independent Irish state. So all over Europe, of course, people are reacting against this supranationalism, and they want to get their democracy back, their national independence back. And you have new movements being formed, of which in Ireland this is one. I thought that I might just try and devote myself to two factual points. I can talk about virtually any aspect of the EU. I've been concerned with it for many a long year. I got a job in Trinity College way back in 1961. My first political act as a young junior lecturer was to organise a collective letter to the Irish Times. And 1961 was the year that Britain applied to join the EEC, and Ireland and Denmark did so simultaneously with it. The United Kingdom, the UK, Britain and the North applied to join, and we did the same. And I organised a collective letter, signed among others by the late Noel Brown, the late Michael Mullen, a well-known trade unionist, and by Mr. Barry Desmond, former Minister for Health, and who was later head of the European Court of Auditors. They all signed that letter way back in 61. This state only joined, of course, in 73 because de Gaulle kept Britain and with Ireland and Denmark out twice during the 60s. And then I got involved in these court cases, as our chairman mentioned. I'd just like to deal with two factual issues, which I think a lot of people may not know. You can talk say an awful lot of things about the EU. First of all, its myth of origin. Every state or aspiring state has what I call a myth of origin, a story, sometimes true, sometimes false, or a mixture of both, as to how it came into being. And the myth of origin of the European Union is that it was a great peace project to prevent Europe's wars, and particularly to prevent wars between France and Germany. And it's holding Europe's peace. It's essentially a peace project, and that's a key element in the propaganda for the EU. And many people who don't really know how the EU works, which is fairly complex in some ways, fall back on that. Oh, it's a peace project. In fact, and I'll just give you a few basic points, the origins of the EU were in war preparations. Way back in 1949, after the war, you had, of course, the world divided between the two superpowers, the United States of America and the USSR. And the Cold War was beginning, and NATO was founded in 1949, and the Americans particularly wanted Germany to be rearmed as part of NATO, founded in 1949. And the French were very upset at the idea of Germany being rearmed only 4 or 5 years after the Germans had occupied France. That was late 40s. So Jean Monnet produced this plan which would overcome French reluctance to rearm in the context of NATO and the Cold War, namely the coal and steel community, whereby the French and the Germans and the Benelux, Holland, Belgium and Luxembourg, would pool their coal and steel industries and put them under a supranational high authority that would make laws for them. And Monnet became the secretary of the supranational high authority, which later merged with the European Commission. So that was the first step towards supranationalism, where a supranational body was set up, the high authority of the coal and steel community, under the 1951 Treaty of Paris. And that was the first supranational element, and it was to overcome French reluctance to accept German rearmament, and it was pushed by the United States of America. And then you followed on the common market in 1957 and so on and so forth. But that's an important point to bear in mind, that the origins really of the EU is not so much in peaceful preparation, but preparation for a war, for the Cold War, or to rearm Germany, etc. And the second big development in EU history, 40 years after that, was the establishment of the euro currency, which occurred, of course, in the treaty was the Treaty of Maastricht in 1992, which gave us the euro currency. The actual currency didn't come into being until the end of the 90s, 1999. But the actual treaty, which provided for its coming into being, was the Treaty of Maastricht, 1992, just a year or two after the fall of communism in Eastern Europe. And of course, the French were very upset at the reunification of Germany, which occurred as a result of the collapse in Eastern Europe. Germany is united as one state. De Gaulle once said, "I like the Germans so much, I prefer two of them." So when Germany was united, the French were more happy than when it was reunited. And Mitterrand went off to try and see if Gorbachev could do anything to stop it, and Mrs. Thatcher wasn't too happy either, the British Prime Minister of the time. But nothing could stop the reunification of Germany. And the Germans, of course, knew that the French were upset at this, because suddenly they had a new German state, a unified German state. Two states became one. The old East Germany was amalgamated with West Germany. And there were suddenly 20 million more citizens in the German Federal Republic. And it was in that context that the idea of the euro was launched as a way of overcoming French reluctance or French unhappiness at the reunification of Germany. And the deal done was that the Germans would give up the Deutschmark, which is the great symbol of their post-war economic achievement, and pool the running of this new currency with the French and others. And the French, in turn, would walk towards a common foreign policy and a common security and military policy with the Germans. Political union for monetary union for political union, as it was put at the time, or put crudely, the Deutschmark for the euro bomb. Because, of course, there is not yet a European army, and there's not yet but they're now talking about it quite openly. Because the Germans, of course, are economically much stronger than the French. There are more of them. There's 20 million more. They have the largest block of votes in the EU Council of Ministers. But they don't have a nuclear weapon, and they're precluded by the post-war treaties from having nuclear weapons. But the French, of course, have a nuclear weapon. So I think this new talk about a European army, which Macron said he wanted it the other week, and Mrs. Merkel echoed him 3 or 4 days ago. Macron said, "We want a European army to defend ourselves against the Russians and the Americans." Astonishing statement, because the Americans came to French and British help during World War I and II. So when Macron said, "We want a European army," and he actually said to defend ourselves against the Russians, the Chinese and the Americans, I haven't seen any sign that they're going to attack the French, but they want a European army, and of course there's the military-industrial complex and a lot of powerful interests like arms orders and so on. But that's the French have the nuclear weapon, and so down the road I wouldn't be surprised if there's a push towards much closer military cooperation and the probable establishment of a European army, which would entail, of course, a European nuclear weapon. And so that's a very important development, because, of course, the Franco-German couple run the European show, more or less. Anything they want, they can really push through. And they push through the euro in that context, and they now want to push through this militarization of the European Union. And they can prevent things that they don't want from happening. And that's actually spelled out in the voting system. The Treaty of Lisbon revised the voting system in the EU for making European laws. It's basically a population voting system now, with the Germans having 16% of the vote. Out of the total, and the French, British and Italians having 12% each, and we have less than 1% of the vote when they have votes. And they all look. Votes are not very common in the European Council of Ministers in making EU laws, but there's a continual process of everyone looking around to see who's backing a particular project, what do I call shadow voting, and if there's enough people to push through a particular law, it goes through. Things are rarely put to a vote, because smaller states aren't going to cause trouble or insist on votes if they're going to lose them. So it's a myth that the EU is essentially a peace project. Has it prevented wars in Europe? Well, the most important wars in Europe in the last 30 years have been the war in Yugoslavia. The breakup of Yugoslavia entailed a vicious civil war between the Serbs on one hand and the Croats on the other. And of course you had the overthrow of the government in Ukraine in 2014, and the breakaway of the eastern provinces of Ukraine, where they all talk Russian, or mostly talk Russian. Both of these developments were strongly encouraged by the EU, particularly by Germany. Germany played a big role in the breakup of Yugoslavia, and the French and British were not too happy about it, but they went along in order to preserve the facade of EU unity way back in 1991. Mr. Hermann Genscher, who was German foreign minister at the time, wrote his memoirs and said the breakup of Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia is a great victory for German foreign policy. We have liquidated the heritage of World War I, because of course Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, and Czechoslovakia were two states that were set up by the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 as a result of World War I, but they've been broken up in the last 10 or 12 years. And Germany played a key role in doing that. They're better able to take over small little countries economically than big ones. I won't go into that in detail. But the idea that that the EU is a peace project is really naive, utterly naive. If you look at its historical origins, or some of the more recent developments in relation to Yugoslavia and even Kosovo and the Ukraine. So that's one bit of information. Perhaps some may not agree with these judgments, but I think one can sustain them. The second point I'd like to put before you is this question of EU citizenship. The Treaty of Lisbon, and you remember, we voted against it in 2008 by a majority of voters turned out. A majority of the electorate, actually 54% or something, of the voters turned out. It's quite high for an Irish referendum. And they voted no to the Treaty of Lisbon in 2008, and then, of course, all hell broke loose, and the establishment in Ireland and the other states pushed it through a second time without without the change of a jot or tittle in the Lisbon Treaty. The Lisbon Treaty, as you may recall, and some of you who remember that incident, was the EU constitution, because the people who've been pushing the EU project all along want to establish an EU federation. I mentioned earlier on the coal and steel community set up in 1951 in order to pool the coal and steel industries of France, Germany and Benelux to reconcile France to German rearmament. That was done, the Schuman Declaration, which proposed this, was issued on May the 9th, 1950. And that is Europe Day to this day. The EU every year commemorates, has a special celebration on Europe Day to commemorate the launch of the Schuman Declaration, which was this big first step towards supranationalism. And the Schuman Declaration said, this is the first step towards the federation of Europe. That's in the Schuman Declaration. And that is celebrated each year as Europe Day, May the 9th, each year in Brussels and those who follow Brussels' notions. The first step in the federation of Europe. A federation is, of course, a state. So the aspiration to turn to pool the major competences of government at supranational level among the main states, among the relevant states of Europe, into a supranational federation has been there all along. And it's hugely progressed. The attainment of the currency was, of course, a major step in that direction. Mr. Prodi, former president of the European Commission, said the two pillars of the nation state are the sword, an army, and a police force to enforce the law, and the currency. If you try and produce your own currency, you're liable to be arrested for counterfeiting. And the sword, the police and army, are there to stop other currencies fluctuating. And every independent state has its own currency, and with it a control of its rate of interest, or its credit control, and its exchange rate. If you don't have a currency of your own, you have no control over the rate of interest, you have no control over the exchange rate, which is very important for influencing the competitive exchanges with other countries. So, of course, as you know, not all member states of the EU have given up their own currencies. There are 28 member states in the EU. 19 are in the Eurozone, the countries that use the euro, including us. Whereas the United Kingdom and Britain and the North of Ireland, of course, isn't. Our genius politicians joined the euro on the assumption the British were going to do so in a year or two. And we will show how communautaire we are by going first. This was way back in 1998 when the decision had to be taken. And the new currency was launched in 1999. And of course, by doing so, we made a huge blunder, in my opinion, because we tied our currency to an area, to a state, or an area, the Eurozone, with which we do only 2/3 of our trade. If you add exports and the Republic's exports and imports together, and they're about two-thirds of our trade is outside the Eurozone. As the countries that are in the Euro, we've tied our currency to the currency of an area with which we do only 1/3 of our trade. And that's extraordinary. Of course, if the United Kingdom had joined, it would have been different, but the United Kingdom didn't. If the United Kingdom had joined the euro, we'd have tied our currency to an area with which we do 2/3 of our trade, but the British didn't. But our politicians said, oh, of course, we'll go first. And of course, we've had the delights of the euro, which probably the most important was the way we reacted to the economic crisis of 2008. You may remember when the collapse happened in 2008 and various banks went bust, above all Anglo-Irish Bank, which was loaded up with bad debts, which had Property Developers Bank, full of bad debts, which had borrowed hugely abroad for on-lending to the Irish property market. Mr. Trinity, who was then governor of the central bank, said, no European bank, Eurozone bank must be let go bust. Because if Anglo-Irish Bank is let go bust, then those who lent money to it won't be repaid, and contagion was spread to other Eurozone countries. And so as a result of that decision, Anglo-Irish, of course, was full of bad debts. It had, during the boom, of course, the Irish banks, particularly Anglo-Irish, but also Bank of Ireland and Allied Irish banks, but Anglo Bank was, of course, the principal one. It was primarily a property developers bank. It didn't have branches in every high street or every main street and so on. But it had borrowed hugely from the French, German and British banks for on-lending to the Irish property market. And so, the only way that it could prevent it from going bust and ensuring that those it had borrowed from were repaid was to load the debts of Anglo-Irish Bank and the other banks onto Irish taxpayers. And 64 billion of bad debts of the Irish banks were loaded on, particularly Anglo-Irish, were loaded onto the Irish taxpayers, of which about 40, it looks as if, some have been some of the properties that the banks had been sold off, but it looks like being a net bill for Irish taxpayers of around 40 billion. And that was insisted on by the European Central Bank. So Irish taxpayers took on board the bad debts of the Irish banks, ensuring thereby that the British, French and German banks that had lent to the Irish banks were repaid. This is one of the pleasures, if you can call it that, of being in the Eurozone. One of the consequences, which a lot of people have even forgotten now, but it's a fact that we're paying still for that delight. But as I said, the move towards a federation has gone on apace over the decades, as more and more competences have been transferred from the national state level to the supranational level, where they're exercised in Brussels by committees which are not responsible to any democratic body. The national states have been hollowed out. I mean, formally they exist still. The Supreme Court is there, but it's no longer supreme, because in a nation, anything that has to do with European law, it's the Court of Justice in Luxembourg. The European Court of Justice is supreme. The Irish Dáil no longer makes most of the laws. Much of its time is passed in turning European law into local statutory instruments, that is, local laws that implement European laws. EU directives. A directive is something that Brussels decides and that it's left to the national state to apply locally, but the national state must apply it. Otherwise, it's subject to heavy fines. And so national states have been hollowed out substantially. The Supreme Court's no longer supreme. Legislatures no longer make most of the laws. As I said earlier on, there's 100,000 legal acts of one kind or another that are supranational in character. We no longer sign trade agreements of our own. That's done if you're a customs union. You have you have a common external tariff around the whole EU, and the EU does the trade agreements on behalf of all the 28 states. That's the customs union, which the original Treaty of Rome was a customs union, and this is the kind of thing that Mrs. May is proposing to sign the United Kingdom into indefinitely, it looks like, under the agreement that's caused so much controversy. And then, of course, the core states of the euro have got their own currency. So this move towards what you might call supranationalism has been going on for a long time. And the latest stage is this talk about possibly moving towards a European military force, which would enable the Germans at last to have their fingers on a nuclear trigger. But way back in 2004, the EU states agreed on the treaty establishing a constitution for Europe. That was the title of it. Giscard d'Estaing, who was the French president at the time, compared it to the United States of America, in Philadelphia, where the United States had come together to set up the United States of America. So the treaty established a constitution for Europe, and the first article of this said, this treaty establishes the European Union. But that treaty was rejected by the French and Dutch in referendums in 2004. No, 2005. And then that was a bad blow to those who wanted the treaty establishing a constitution for Europe. So the provisions of the treaty were presented as amendments to existing treaties in the Treaty of Lisbon. And 99% of the Treaty of Lisbon was, in effect, the treaty establishing a constitution for Europe. And it established the European Union as a legal entity for the first time. Before that, the European Union did not have legal personality. The European Community was the supranational body. But the Treaty of Lisbon, previously the treaty establishing a constitution for Europe, abolished the European Community and replaced it by the European Union. So now the Irish state is not a sovereign state anymore, it's part of a union of states, the European Union. And we're all citizens of that. Classical federal constitutions mean that sovereignty is divided between the federal level and the local or provincial level. And that citizens have two citizenships, the federal citizenship and the local citizenship. And the Treaty of Lisbon, previously the Treaty establishing a constitution for Europe, did that with the EU. It gave us all real citizenship. You can only be a citizen of a state. Citizenship implies statehood. You're a citizen of a state. And this is a very important development. It was hardly discussed during the Treaty of Lisbon referendum, but it's legally and politically very important that we now have two citizenships, as in any classical federal constitution. In the United States of America, everyone in America is a citizen of the United States of America, the Federal Union of America. They also are citizens of New York, or or Colorado, or California, or Texas. You're a citizen of the local state as well. Most people don't know that, but that's a fact. You have two citizenships because sovereignty is divided between the federal and the local level. In the Federal Republic of Germany, you're a citizen of the Federal Republic of Germany, but you're also a citizen of Brandenburg, or Hamburg, or Baden, or Württemberg, or whatever the local states are, the lender of the Federal Republic of Germany. So the European Union has got that characteristic. It's got a federal constitution with two citizenships, and if there's any conflict in the rights and duties between the rights and duties of the federal level and the local level, any conflict, the former has primacy, because the characteristic of EU law is that EU law, in relation to anything in the treaties, has primacy over national law in case of any conflict. So we're now a real citizen of a foreign entity, if you like, or an entity that's certainly not, in which Ireland has 1% of the vote, and where most people, the decisions are taken by people whom we don't, of course, elect and so on. And there is, of course, a reaction against this process all over Europe, as people realise the loss of democracy, the loss of independence, loss of the ability to take the decisions, loss of the ability to control their politicians, loss of ability to, if they don't like the laws they make, periodically dismiss them or not elect them. There's a reaction everywhere. The new party in Germany, the AfD, the Lega party in Italy, and so on and so forth. And here, of course, this important development, this Irexit movement, is full of importance for the future, in my opinion. Now, just the last few comments on the current state of play in relation to the Brexit treaty, or the Brexit referendum, rather, the Brexit business. That, of course, is a very bad blow to the United Kingdom, that one state, or to the EU, that one state, a major member of the EU, should seek to leave it. And there's consternation, really, in EU circles at the British vote, and consternation in Irish circles, because we assumed that they would stay in. And I believe every attempt has been made to ensure that this will not happen, that the Brexit process will be aborted in some way, or prevented, or headed off, or that if it does come off, that it will only be Brexit in name only, and that the United Kingdom, Britain and the North of Ireland would remain as closely attached as possible to the EU under the existing regime as much as possible, and the customs union, single market, and all the rest of it. Mrs. May's Lancaster House speech last year said that we want the United Kingdom. She said that Brexit means Brexit. Brexit should mean leaving the customs union, because the Treaty of Rome was originally a customs union with a protected agricultural policy attached. And the single market, which entails a vast corpus of rules and regulations to harmonise this, that, and the other, and to ensure goods are harmonised and the production of exchange of goods is harmonised throughout the Union, or throughout the EU. But she had, of course, that disastrous election, which wasn't helpful for her, and then she seems to have handed over the negotiating of this agreement between the United Kingdom and the EU to Sir Humphrey Appleby, otherwise the big man in Westminster, otherwise known as Oliver Robbins. In other words, she's handed it over to the civil service. The civil service were overwhelmingly Remainers, of course, as she was herself. And they produced a document which they hope would keep the EU as close as possible to the existing situation. Our people in Dublin, of course, want that as well. And I believe that the so-called backstop of the north of Ireland is purely a device to try and keep the EU as close as possible, keep the British and Irish states as close as possible to the EU. North-South trade is tiny in proportion to total EU trade. Even North-South trade is quite modest in comparison with trade between the north of Ireland and mainland Britain. And but the idea of the only way, the suggestion is the only way we can ensure that there's no barriers or no new barriers or controls north and south is if the existing situation remains as close as possible to what it is, that the new situation remains as close as possible to what it is. In other words, that you don't have any change in the customs regime or the rules and regulations governing the single market, and so on and so forth. And so from the point of view of the Irish establishment and those who want minimum change, that was what Mrs. May came back the other day with from Brussels was very advantageous from their point of view. And the Brussels people are delighted. Of course, it's created a huge reaction in the Conservative Party and is unlikely to pass through the House of Commons. There was great triumph the other day in the newspapers. Suddenly, they realised that, of course, the objections in the House of Commons and among the various interests, both on the Conservative side and the Labour side, and indeed many Remainers are dismayed about this particular deal. They say it won't go through the House of Commons. Well, does that mean that you'll have a so-called sudden or hard Brexit with Britain leaving the EU at the end of March? Because legally, Britain must leave, or the United Kingdom must leave the EU at the end of March, under the Article 50 provision, which provides for that under the Treaty of Lisbon. And so you have today's headlines, a fear of a hard border. The delight of the other day is changing to a certain disquiet. Hard border looming, says the Irish Independent. No deal will trigger hard border, says the Irish Examiner. The Irish Daily Mail. If May can't pass our deal, we'll have to police the border. That is, of course, the fear of the Irish establishment, that if the United Kingdom really leaves the EU, if it does leave the customs union and single market, there certainly will have to be some new controls on trade and tariffs and all the rest of it. And if we want to stay in the EU, well then we'll be adding new dimensions to partition. We will be responsible. The only way of actually, if Britain really leaves the EU, or the United Kingdom really leaves the EU, the only way of ensuring that there's no problems in North-South, no new barriers between North and South, no new partition, is that we leave as well. Obviously. And that fear has animated the whole Brexit process, the whole negotiation. The British and the Irish government, the EU Commission and the Irish government are very well aware that if there was a real Brexit with Britain leaving the United Kingdom leaving the single market and the customs union, that it would mean significant new additions to the border north and south, and that this would have an inevitable reaction in southern public opinion over time. And people here would say, well, shouldn't we leave too? Because you have a new partition, which the Irish government will be responsible for by their decision to stay in the EU. That is the main point. If May can't pass the deal, we'll have to police the border. So whether that comes about, no one can say. But I think my own belief is that Britain will leave, and the United Kingdom will leave the EU. The late Desmond Greaves, a well-known historian, once said, all significant debates in British politics take place inside the Tory party, with everyone else having bit parts. On the big issues, the Corn Laws in the 19th century, imperial preference at the end of the 19th century, appeasement of Germany in the 30s, mainstream Tories were for appeasement, Churchill was the dissenter, and of course relations with the EU over the last 50 years. It was the Tories under Heath brought the United Kingdom, Britain, into the EU, and it's the Conservatives under Mrs May or whoever may succeed her who want to bring her out. I believe the Conservatives, they thought when they originally joined the EU that they'd either split France from Germany or else they'd be co-opted by France and Germany and running the whole show as a kind of triumvirate. I think that was the original idea, because Macmillan was the first person to orient the UK towards joining the EU after Suez, the Suez debacle, and the Americans pushed Macmillan in that direction, Kennedy and so on. And then just Heath brought Britain into the EU, but they went for political reasons. They'd lost confidence in their capacity to be an independent state. Their economy had been going downhill for years before, and they'd either divide France and Germany, or else be quarter by France and Germany and running the whole show together as a trio. Both those visions have failed. France and Germany have stuck close together. The balance of power has shifted between them. Now the Germans are on top. It used to be the French. But now that after the reunification of Germany, it's Germany's running the show, or with France holding on to its coattails. Now France has a nuclear weapon, which Germany hasn't got, so France still has some cards to play. So Britain failed to divide them. And so a shift of opinion within the Tory party over years, I know quite a number of the people involved, has occurred, and I believe that the Conservative Party will bring Britain and the United Kingdom as a whole out of the EU in due course. We can't say at this moment in time how. We know the situation is rather up in the air. Will Mrs May survive? If she's replaced by somebody else, can they get some other deal? But our people are rather scared that some other deal might be significantly worse, would be significantly worse than what was agreed the other day. And a hard Brexit would put us on the spot and put our government, our establishment on the spot. But of course it would enable the state to get back control of its own laws and control of its own policies. Of course, a big problem is the euro, though. We did join the euro, which is an extra dimension of difficulty if we want to leave the EU. The UK doesn't have the euro. And of course, realistically, for us to leave the EU and you'd also have to leave the euro, of course. There's no provision for leaving the euro on its own. It means leaving the EU and re-establishing one's own currency. There's a strong argument for the value and benefit of that. Because, of course, we're stuck with an overvalued currency, the euro, which is really not very helpful for us in many ways. And particularly if sterling goes down and the dollar goes down, it's going to put us more or export us under greater pressure. And, of course, Europe is no longer the cash cow that it was for so long. But these are issues which, no doubt, Herman and Declan will be discussing down the road. I hope I put some points before you that have some use or interest, and thank you very much.